Can everybody hear me? Hello? Awesome. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Welcome. I am Kelly. I am one of the hosts of People and Places. Thank you so much for joining us this evening from wherever you are, or afternoon, I guess, if you're on the West Coast. Welcome to our second event called On Being Alone. So I know some of you have been to a People and Places event before. Some of you probably have not, but it's usually an in-person gathering where we have the privilege of experiencing space and experiencing each other in the flesh. And while we don't have that luxury tonight, we're really excited to bring people together from near and far. There are actually about 100 people on the call, which is really, really awesome. So we're excited to do this new thing with you guys, and we encourage you to, even though we can't be in person, consider the connection that we're all able to share by being here, the nature of disparate spaces, but sharing them simultaneously. So I want to talk about a little bit about People and Places for those of you guys who have not been to an event before. It's a monthly gathering that is focused on exploring the human relationship to space, interior space in all of its forms, whether internal emotional reaction to space, the physical space that surrounds us, but really our goal is to deepen the human relationship with our environment. And, we do that through conversation, community building, and having different thinkers and creators speak, like the two amazing women that you will hear tonight. The other part of People and Places is usually a tangible element where we actually hand out binders and physical essays, reading lists, materials, all that good stuff to attendees. People can sketch and write their thoughts in person and share. So we don't have that luxury tonight either, but we will follow up with essays from all the speakers, reading lists that we put together with the panelists. And in the spirit of People and Places, we do encourage you to get out a piece of paper and sketch, take down notes, ask questions in the Q&A as you go, or save them for the end. But either way, hopefully this gets you thinking, and feel free to jot down or sketch whatever is more comfortable for you along the way. So the other thing is that every month we have a new topic that we explore. This one is called On Being Alone. And that happened to come at a time when a lot of new experiences are coming up, from isolation to solitude to thinking about community and connection, how we design for these things and in light of them. I don't want to get too far into the topic. I will hand it over to Michael, who can tell you a little bit more about the topic of On Being Alone. But thank you so much for being here. And again, the Q&A is there, the chat's there, so feel free to ask questions and participate as we go.
Thank you. Yeah, hey all, Michael here. Yeah, I just wanted to dig in a little bit to why we picked this topic. Yeah, funnily enough, it was a topic that we had on our boards for months previous to the quarantine. It taps into a lot of the empathic and emotional elements that that both Kelly and I think are lacking in a lot of spatial practice. The idea of designing for two people really can't be done unless you know how to design for one. So this was really, as we were planning out the events, this was really meant to be a stepping stone into a lot of deeper topics that come later in the series. Later on, we were wanting to talk about intimacy, on family, on a home away from home, on talking about behavior in public space, all of which require this rooting in understanding what it means to be a human in space. And the future of design and creative practice needs to be rooted in this human experience. And that requires us to break the experience down into an essential element, which is one person's vulnerability within space. And I think now more than ever, that is really apparent. A lot of people are forced into isolation, maybe for the first time. Yeah, so for many of us, like the solitude's new, and it might be a shock to your system, deeply uncomfortable. And since it might have been forced upon you, if you are alone through these circumstances, you might feel like without agency or powerless. But I think a big point of having this event is for us to talk about other people that have gone through this same type of experience, and that people that have experienced similar isolation really understand the power of isolation. I think the power of having time to think really helps you focus on the shell you inhabit. There's a power in having the time and space to discover yourself, to dig into your surroundings, and through that really expand your thinking into like a really bigger universe outside of all of us. Yeah, the power of isolation empowers you to focus and think deeply. And the power of the human mind to expand is really powerful, for lack of a better term. And with that space, you're able to make very far-reaching connections. And we feel like that, more than anything, is the building block that people and places and a human approach to design needs to be built on. So yeah, that's kind of like why the topic and why we feel it's so important. And today we're going to hear two very different perspectives on being alone. First, from an artist who has voluntarily dealt with the topic in her work, and second, from a designer who dives deep into her work to the study of the human condition and design of space. So first, just in terms of a schedule, Jemila MacEwan is going to speak first for about a half an hour on becoming human meteorite. And then afterwards, Suchi Reddy is going to talk for 30 minutes too on her manifesto on being alone. So as we go, feel free to put questions as you go or save them for the end into the Q&A. And then afterwards, we're going to have all of us back on the screen, and we're going to answer questions and have a Q&A session at the end. So Jemila. Jemila is an artist that I've worked a lot with in the past, and she's an artist whose work draws connections between people and places, material, culture, spirituality, and like deep human experience. I think truly great artists hone a skill of vulnerability, almost as if it's like a craft. And Jemila falls right in line with that. Her work spans sculpture, environmentalism, dance, painting, therapy, ceramics, earthworks, performance. A few of her works, like her film The Wake, which we actually showed at Cooler Gallery, is a surreal allegory that reckons with the complex emotions of being human within the Holocene extinction, or the extinction of humans. Her performance piece, Maiden Grass Voyage, had Jemila wearing a bodysuit woven of grass with tendrils reaching out as she traveled the city. Um, Basically, a pure exploration of being alone in public. And with her talk today, Jemila is going to discuss the time 2 years ago when she traveled into a field in the California desert and became human meteorite. In doing so, she isolated herself for a month, armed with just a shovel and simple hand tools, and created an impact site on the earth. Jemila is going to walk us through this journey, through the trials that she went through and how it deeply impacted her. Welcome, Jemila.
Hello. So thank you very much for having me. Presenting online is not something that really comes naturally to me. I much prefer to be speaking in person with you all. However, these times are keeping us separate, and I am nonetheless glad to be speaking with all of you. By way of a practical introduction to this topic of being alone, I am going to propose that we spend a little bit of time together in silence. I'm going to tell you when to close your eyes, and I want you to resist. I want you to resist going into any kind of a state of meditation that you might be accustomed to. So if you feel the wish to go into a state of calm breathing, I just want you to breathe naturally. If you feel that you want to purify your mind, that is not the intention of this. We're going to spend 2 minutes with our eyes closed, just paying attention to everything that is going on inside us, so that we can see actually what the raw, uncomfortable, strange, and chaotic material is that needs to be accommodated when we think about how to design for, or how to consider what it is to be alone as a human. So for the next 2 minutes, please close your eyes, just observe, and begin. And you can open your eyes now. So congratulations for sitting through 2 minutes with your own mind. It's actually not an easy thing to do. In my work, I spend a lot of time with my own mind. And today I'm going to talk about a project that I did 2 years ago called Human Meteorite. Now, this project, I spent 30 days digging with just hand tools an impact crater into the land. The intention of this project was to give me space to reckon with what it meant to be human. And to do that, it really necessitated spending a lot of time in that space of what is going on in my mind. And this is a very practical way to deal with humanity, is to really just deal with the raw material of oneself. So if if you can spend time with the raw material of oneself while there is some conceptualizing that goes into that space, ultimately you can come back from an experience like that and really say that you came to know what you are. This project I have presented in many ways, as lectures, as exhibition in a gallery. And while this has been a really effective way to tell the story of Human Meteorite, 2 years on, I'm finding that I am very much wanting to get much deeper into this project and putting this project into a form that could reach more people. So currently I'm writing a book, and today I am going to read you the excerpts, or some of the excerpts relating to specifically to being alone. This book is currently being written, so this is very fresh material. It is material that I've mostly written during this time of being in solitude in quarantine. So that experience of being in quarantine is definitely influencing the writing also. I'm going to begin by reading you just a little bit of the prologue, just to give you a sense of a more detailed sense of why I'm writing this book. There came a point in the retelling of the stories of Human Meteorite that I became fatigued by it. I found I was weary of reliving the memories of what had been emotionally complex experiences, and I was increasingly abbreviating, neatening, packaging the lessons I had learned. I started to feel that eventually I might forget how much of the journey had depended on maintaining a state of open innocence and deep uncertainty. It is within this state of unknowingness now that I begin telling the stories of Human Meteorite, truthfully, gratefully, and with curiosity. It is my hope that with these stories, the reader will feel a way towards the kind of aliveness that I experienced out in the field, where all experiences, beautiful, painful, and mundane alike, can bring great gifts in the form of lessons. What follows is a series of stories that stratify, circle, and radiate from a single task: digging a crater, using hand tools, every day for the length of one lunar cycle. From this point on, every encounter becomes part of the limitations, the lessons, and the gifts that present themselves and ultimately are woven into the earth through the repeated circular ritual of digging. I'm going to begin by reading 3 of the chapters that really shaped the environment of the work. The first chapter, Breaking Ground, is a candid description of the first moments of the performance. The second chapter, A Great Shame, is really a description of everything that I believed that I was going to be contending with and how that actually changed once the project began. The third piece I'm going to read is a poem. That poem is an ode to the tools that I worked with, and specifically 2 words that were printed on those tools, and how those words carried me in the space of Human Meteorite. So let's begin. Breaking Ground, Day 1, November 4, full moon. When my alarm goes off, it is still mostly dark outside. I'm warm in bed, and it's so cold in the room that the windows are wet with condensation from my breath. I motivate myself out of bed through nervous anticipation alone. I layer up thermals, and over the top, I put my meteorite printed tunic and jacket, still crisp and new, and my straw hat. This has the ceremonial effect of composing me the way that costume does. I walk out into the field with my shovel, mattock, camera, and tripod, all in the bucket of the wheelbarrow, straight towards the huge full moon floating midway above the horizon, sliding rapidly towards the tree line, the sky getting brighter one moment to the next. I break into a run towards the dig site. Before the moon drops out of view, I turn my body towards it, eyes fix as it pales against the brightening sky. I cast my eyes downward and jump onto the step of the shovel, plunging it into the soil, and tilting the handle back, I release grass roots and earth from the ground. Sliding one hand all the way down to the collar and using the other to steady the handle, I lift the mass of soil into the wheelbarrow, its gravity a corporeal confrontation to the weightless dreamland this idea has existed in until this moment. The seriousness of the physical reality of this task begins constricting my chest with a fear bordering on despair. I feel I may have gone too far. I have set myself a task on the frontier of madness. Unsure of what to do with my doubt, I simply continue this action several more times, feeling the wheelbarrow, my courage wavering, and as I do, the earth's shadow shifts around me, the sun breaking the skyline above the hills, soaking my cold face in its blinding energy. I feel honored by the place I find myself, between three enormous celestial bodies whose rotations will define the time limits of the work. The sun determining the length of each day, and the moon cycle announcing the start and end of my performance as the human meteorite. The constellation of these immense clocks shifting every day. I am compelled to honor the presence of these bodies through ritual. Moving intuitively, I lay down the choreography for what becomes a daily gesture of gratitude. Walking clockwise around the interior of the impact site, I chime the blade of the shovel with a stick 30 times, the number of days I have left. In a second circuit, I bow to the moon just as it disappears from view and walk to the opposite side. I bow to the sun where it hangs, beaming across hills and fields, numbing my retinas and saturating my body in raw celestial light. A great shame. In planning this project, I imagined that I'm going to spend most of my time contemplating the irreconcilably huge story of human impact on our planet. I bring to the field a preconceived notion of that story. It is the story of greed and conquest. I perceive myself as part of a lineage of violent abusers who knowingly facilitated the genocide of fellow humans, animals, and plants alike. A species whose sense of kinship to one another and to all other life has been corrupted by cruel dogmas that masqueraded first as divine authority and then as logic and reason, changing with the times to as always seem irrefutable. Our fate as the ultimate destroyers of the planet seem as inarguable as rock, as predestined as the trajectory of an asteroid. I've come to this field to reckon with this narrative. I need to know what it means to be human, and to learn about being human, I must first face the shame that I feel about the story I've heard about humans on this planet. There are ancient and known paths whose patterns are unchanging that take us through the transformations of the human spirit. These paths are etched into us so that we do not need anyone to explain them if we can live them. As children, we are shown how to perform the necessary rituals that help us grow, how to recognize the feeling of shame, how to share, how to sacrifice, how to wait, how to receive, how to find courage, how to mourn. Though many times I have seen how these lessons are not taught correctly, either because the adults around did not learn them right, or they were too lazy or exhausted to pay attention when the lessons were needed. So when the human spirit is germinating, something goes wrong in the teaching and a spiritual defect occurs. But these paths are so etched into our humanity, carved deep into us like petroglyphs into stone, that they can, with patience, be found and restored. The path that I am on now is the path through shame. I share this shame with my ancestors and my species. It is vast and it stretches through eons and across all lands. It is an unequal shame. For a long time, the defenseless has been consumed by the laborious project of consumption through the mechanization of society, while the lion's share of atrocities has always been the enterprise of the ultra-powerful. Controlling others' means of survival has always been the most effective method for creating willing subservience. Even the many and varied Indigenous folk of the world, whose way of living in relationship to land was one of reciprocity and respect for the commons, and to whom the project of consumption was foreign, were forced to betray their own values to legally protect what little land and culture was left after everything else had been stolen or erased. I feel this shame as a great heaviness. The inventory of this immense cargo is barely known to me, but I carry it with me out to the field all the same, in a hope to walk with it and know it better. And yet, I am taken off guard when I find myself spending almost no time at all contemplating the big questions of humanity's dreadful story. Instead, I am drowned in memories of the petty minutiae of events of my own life. The responsibility that I hold for my people can only be what is within my own grasp. To reckon with the bigger story, I must come to peace with my small place within it. I don't know the exact path, but I am certain this is the way: to spend time digging, in repetition, in ceremony with the land, performing a symbolic act of violence, being the violence so that I can witness it within myself. This is the act of atonement, and it is the first step through the way of shame. True temper. These words embossed into the blade of my shovel and rust-stained letters on the side of my wheelbarrow. True temper. A perfect two-word poem. These words leaven my thoughts as I rest from digging, pausing between barrow loads, and my mind soft and my eyes lazy, hang from them. True temper. I marvel that these words came to be, branded like a prayer onto such common tools, by someone who must have understood to their bones the humbling and spare devotion of labour. Tempering the filaments of the soul is a granular process. The spirit is the metal, labour is the hammer. The land is the anvil, the body is the forge. To labour in land is to abandon the weight of conflict and surrender oneself to the fairness of the physical world. To labour with freedom is to unearth truth born of matter, a truth with no shortcut. An unrare earth magnet, it runs rivers through the land. Repetition tempers the mind and body, that volatile alloy into noble matter. The sublime indifference of land renders lies, corruptions, and delusions inert, leaving bare only truth. The next chapter I'm going to read you is called The Cadence of Digging. This chapter is much closer to the internal process of what was happening as I was human meteorite. I'd also like to share that during this project, I was giving live broadcasts. I know live broadcasts have become this ubiquitous thing at this moment, but back then they weren't so common. And every morning as I walked out into the fields before I had coffee, I would give a reckoning of how I felt that morning. And this chapter that I'm about to read, The Cadence of Digging, is a demonstration of really why I needed that tether to the outside world and why I needed to feel connected to people, even though I was actually quite isolated. The Cadence of Digging. When I describe human meteorite to people who are unfamiliar with working in land, I find their imagination of digging work resembles early silent films in which soot-covered workers frantically stoke the furnace of a coal train, or cartoons in which characters who appear to be made out of rubber heave-ho soil in fluid cyclical motions. In their minds, the effort of human meteorite seems heroically superhuman. The reality of the rhythm of sustained digging is much slower. Each shovel load is a sequence of steady and careful actions. I hold the shovel vertically. The tip of the blade is positioned. I jump onto the step, plunging it into the earth. I tilt the handle back to free the wedge of soil. I squat, grip the collar. I hold the blade close to my body and rise, stepping up each level out of the crater. I drop the lump of soil into the wheelbarrow, careful not to throw the whole bucket off balance. And then I step down into the crater, measure, position my shovel, and repeat. There are internal mental forces at work that frequently feel entirely out of sync with the digging itself, and they often derail the calm, systematic sequence of physical actions. The action of digging has the mysterious effect of unearthing memories and emotions lodged in the body. They reflect the inner athenaeum of emotional experiences that haunt the soul the way ghosts haunt old houses. These intrusions from the past catch me midway through an action, seizing me in a spasm of the heart or gut. They expose themselves as abruptly and sometimes with such fierceness of pain. It is as though I am transported body and soul into past versions of myself, into moments of my life that were so emotionally bewildering, and I, without any powers of reconciliation, had no choice but to bury the dis-ease inside me, to be carried indefinitely, preserved in the fatty marrow of my bones. The most potent of these are the senseless injustices inflicted on me, or on others, and sometimes even by me. Some memories describe events so darkly perverse, they are too fucked up to be named. The acute cruelty of these memories reject the possibility of forgiveness. Other milder discomforts, the betrayals and the contradictions, are encased in denial because their truth was too destabilizing at the time. These are the moments of banal selfishness, the laziness of unfairness, the misunderstandings, the mild humiliations. The mean thing I said to my mother that one time that I am pretty certain made her cry. And the shame I felt about it, but did not have the words or the courage to say anything. The feeling of that silence. They all come to the surface. It is a reckoning. They all must be faced, felt, forgiven, moved out from their lonely hiding places. At times, I fall to my knees, grabbing the soil in my fists, pulling them to my chest. I wail a long, mournful wail for the hurt that has been. Something huge and heavy tipping out of my body, through my throat, and into the earth. Soft tears. I press my forehead into the cold soil, arms folded beneath me, and I feel held at last. A lightness lifting my chest skyward. I feel calm. I stay for a moment here, breathing, resting, the cool, damp, and fragrant earth soothing my body, the sun warming me, my wet eyes closed, the breeze in the trees a lullaby. And at last, slowly I pull myself to my feet, wipe my eyes with the back of my hand, lift the shovel vertically, position the tip of the blade, inhale and jump. This is the cadence of digging. So I have two more pieces that I'd like to read to you. One of them relates somewhat to the essay that is going to be available through the website, which is about really being alone in the proximity to wild animals. So the essay is also an excerpt from the book, and the essay is a chapter about worms and how worms came to be a spiritual guide for me of sorts through this digging. And the chapter that I'm going to read now is another interaction that I had with animals that was a little more mysterious, perhaps. And then I'm going to finish with a poem. And that poem really describes 3 words that really became a lifeline for me, that I literally said out loud again and again as this project became hard. So to begin, I will read Watched. There comes a time when I am evenly strong, body, mind, and spirit braided together as one, each part equally broad and strong, folding over one another in mutual support to form an even and reliable rope. The braiding of being happens through work and attention. Digging keeps the focus. Each strand can only continue as far as its fellow counterparts. There is a harmony in the purposefulness of the process, now that I have the hang of it. It is on one of these days of deep, contented digging that something new happens. A gentle change in the breeze. I feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My heart becomes staccato. Someone is watching me. Holding my shovel like a staff, the tip gently pressed into the ground, I extend my senses into the tree line. My vision and hearing are not acute enough, but my instincts are crisp. They pin my eyes onto a precise location in the dark shadows of the underbrush. There in the dimness, a presence. Its attention on me. Standing there, staring into eyes I cannot see, I feel the watcher's animality, and I stand there feeling the faintest tug of connection, breathing gently, gazing into that primeval lacuna. Then swiftly the signal is dropped. But from that point on, I have the sense of having unlocked some ancient gift sealed in my blood. I find I can sense when animals, using the tree line as a corridor for safe passage, stop to observe me, though I never know who they are because I cannot see them. Kathy's words return to my mind. Remember to take care of the animals. A mantra. There is a mantra you can say when all else fails. I love you. You can say it when an impossible weight shackles you, tugging wrists and heart groundward. I love you. When you are certain your body contains not 1 ounce more of strength, and you feel daunted and alone, and the future is numb. I love you. When with fierceness you wish to be granted godlike powers to allay the great cycle of suffering, to lay a hammer to the machine of abuse, cruelty, and neglect. I love you. When the anger you have been carrying all this time finally breaks apart, a dense and tender sadness contained within. When the sage of that sadness is a child, is you. I love you. When you feel abandoned but cannot answer the question, by whom? I love you. When you are changed and the world is changed also, I love you. When resting, weary in long grass, your thighs ache with gratitude, I love you. When a dead frog you found yesterday comes back to life, looks you in the eye and says, look, here am I love you. When a dragonfly captures you in a daydream, your fingers pressed softly to lips, I love you. When the sun shines clearly through the world, light and warmth as one gift, illuminating a myriad of perfect spiderwebs cast between golden blades of grass, glistening with vanishing diamonds of ice. It shines these words through you too. I love you. When the round moon hangs whole and bright, holding you with its grace, humbling your heart, it shows you what completeness looks like. I love you. When all other words fail, I love you. 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 Thank you all for listening. Those are all the excerpts that I'm going to read today. This is an ongoing project for me now, writing this book. So you can follow along with me if you are interested in where this project goes. It's been a real pleasure to share this with you as it is in the process of being written. I think for me personally, it's a way to help me to check in to make sure that I'm really writing honestly about the work, especially since so much of the work is about honesty itself. And I would like to thank Michael and Kelly for having me at People and Places. And with that, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jemila. As we move on to the next presentation, I just wanted to remind everybody that if you have thoughts or questions, you can chat them in the queue or put them in the Q&A, and we will save them for the end when we kind of wrap everything up and can talk about the presentations as one. I'd like to introduce Suchi Reddy. Suchi runs her own architecture and design studio in New York. She's worked on a number of projects from residential to public space installations. I think one of the things that we found the most compelling about her work is that it follows this notion of form follows feeling, and it guides her design process, meaning she believes our environment should evoke something within us, and that space, when calibrated to the human, influences well-being and creativity, which I think is something that is really important right now. She's done research with partners like Google and Johns Hopkins on neuroaesthetics, which is how the built environment affects us. And she will share some of these perspectives tonight, which I think will inspire us to consider details a bit more closely. So with that, welcome, Suchi.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. And thank you, Michael. Thank you, Jemila. And thank you, Kelly. Jemila, that was so inspiring and so beautiful. Thank you. I wanted to start talking about design really from kind of the perspective of how our humanness actually informs our sense of being alone. And I think this is a particular time when all of us are either too alone or not alone enough. And it's a good time to think about how and what aloneness means. And when I was about 13, I was crossing the schoolyard, which was uncharacteristically deserted. And I had an epiphany that I was born alone and I will die alone. And for a young person, this was a bit, to chew off. It fell on my head kind of like a brick. But decades later, I came to this phrase by one of my favorite Stoic philosophers, Seneca: I am not alone, I walk with myself, which then makes me think, what is the company I walk in? How do I feel when I walk with myself? And how do my spaces make me feel when I walk with myself? So this act of design, of architecture, of making art, of making experiences on ourselves, I think is a very important one that teaches us about our own humanness. So as architects and designers, poets of space and experience, it's our privilege and our domain to create the context and the conditions in which human beings walk with themselves. The quality of the company we keep is crucial to our sense of well-being, our sense of wholeness, and our sense of connection to our environments and others. How then do we foster the conditions for us to be with our best selves? What role do the arts and architecture play in molding us in this direction? This led me to my fascinations both with science and architecture, and the new science of neuroaesthetics, which is, as Kelly had mentioned, the study of the effect of the arts and of aesthetic experiences on our brains and bodies. And this science would tell us that their role is crucial and constant. We mold and shape our inner constellations constantly as we move through the outer ones of our environments. Must we not then design our world consciously? Caring for ourselves means caring for the quality of our environment, from the most proximal, our homes, which many of us are spending so much time in now, to the one most distal, the far reaches of our planet. So before our news feeds became overwhelmed with this global pandemic that has us thinking about designing for isolation, loneliness was on an epidemic rise in our culture. An emerging question in the work of urban designers and architects, scientists and statisticians combating loneliness, the time we find ourselves in now brings home the importance of truly understanding the difference between being alone and being lonely. So comfortably being alone, happily walking with ourselves, and finding it a replenishing experience is not only the realm of the yogi, it can be everyone's. And there is no better time than now to discover the delights of that experience. Supportive space, engagement in the arts, and responsive architecture can enhance the reward circuitry in our brains. Science has shown this, allowing us then to appreciate social connection when we find it. We can aim to create spaces and cities that restore us instead of accelerating dysfunction, that help us find the joy in our private worlds and therefore in our connection to others. Jemila's work was such a beautiful example of being alone and finding that connection singularly. We need a deeper understanding and an appreciation of the value of the poetics and aesthetics of space, one that stands up to the changing winds of trends and the seductive swings of technology, and heeds the true north of the compass of our essential experience of ourselves. Conscious, human-centric design can help us get there, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many of my peers. So in design, on being alone really means communing through our senses. So here I will quote Richard Neutra, who in his famous and one of my favorite books, Survival Through Design, which will be on the reference list, says, "From a baby carriage to a metropolis, our man-made surroundings, top-heavy with technological trickery, have become our mold of destiny and a source of never-ending nervous strain." He wrote this in 1954 in a book that he dedicated to Frank Lloyd Wright. So in design, I'd like to take us on a path through communing with ourselves, through communing with the senses. And I'd like to prioritize the sense of touch. And you'll see why I do this ahead of the sense of sight. I do this for a couple of reasons. One is that we live in such an oculocentric world. And in the words of Johanni Plasma and one of my favorite essays, The Eyes of the Skin, we can learn a lot from the world of touch. It really is the primal way in which we learn about our surroundings when we're infants. It is how we experience space. And as designers, unless we understand how we feel through our skin, as Michael said, how can we really design for someone else to understand how they feel in their skins? So I'd love to privilege that over this image, which still brings in the importance of sight. Seeing, like other sensing, was decisively trained within the natural scene. Time is of its essence, although seeing seems to deal only with space. So I'd like to bring you back to the idea of touch. While seeing is important, I think it's much more important to really understand in design the idea of touch and texture. So when we work with spaces, when we work with materials, and when we work with making those spaces and materials for people, I think it's extremely important and essential to think about how that feels. Form follows feeling has been one of the guiding principles of my practice. And I come to that from a lot of different perspectives. And in architecture, I'll try to show a few examples of the way that this texture plays out. And a lot of these images that you'll see coming forth are stills from a film that will play in the end, which is a project where we studied the effect of space on people, or at least tried to demonstrate that space has an effect on your brain and body. This is an image of a burnt wood art panel next to white rutted paper. And what I wish I could show you also in this mode, which I can't, is the smell. The burnt wood actually had this beautiful smell, and everyone who experienced this actually touched it. And I knew, because I designed a very white space that was a follow-up to this, and I could see the black finger marks everywhere. But the thing that people talked about was touching it, smelling it, and feeling it. And this is the kind of experience that we want people to feel, because we want them to commune with their environment in a way that makes them understand it and lets them know that their environment is also responding to them. So in places of respite, like our bedrooms, which I think a lot of us are spending more time in than we have recently, I think this idea of texture in design becomes incredibly important. And I'd like to show you this image really to just separate, just for argument's sake, the idea of color from texture. This is a very Kubrickian white cubicle where you were learning some information about yourself in our project. And here I use this as an example to really study the fact that texture doesn't need color. You can understand a space and you can understand the difference between different boundaries without it. This image takes me to my next sense that I would like to bring your attention to, which is the sensing of color and of light. This is a project that's located in Miami. It responds to the very bright light of that space. And it really helps to modulate the light coming into a space in lots of different ways. And what this does and illustrates, as you see in this example, is really the importance of how light can move around a space. These are light studies that are very crucial to our exploration of spaces. This was a small space where with a very narrow window, where we really tried to make sure that we could study the way the light moved in the space, which enhanced and informed the shape, the texture, the materials, and therefore the experience of this space. As Nurture says, in interiors in our urban existence, light and color call for more informed watchfulness than eyes have needed for life outside in unhampered nature. Unhampered nature. That being the place where our experience of all senses can come together. And being the place where we've come from, it's also a place that we long for. And this connection to nature, where we can feel, sense, see, touch, hear, and understand light, color, and texture all at the same time, is something that's so important that the Japanese have taken to calling it forest bathing and using it as a restorative method for people who are stressed. And I'd like to just dwell on this image a little bit because for me, it's kind of a seminal idea of how we take this sense of touching a tree, of feeling the dappled light around it, of learning what the texture of the bark is, to the experience of being indoors, of being in architecture and in interiors. How do we relate to our environment in the same way as you see these hands relating to this tree trunk? In this project, we tried to do it by making this indoor-outdoor space flow very freely together, so that the dappled light that comes off of the water, even if it's a narrow lot, to make you feel like it's a very wide open space because you're sensing the boundary of basically your neighbor, and really feeling the play of materials and textures against each other. And in this image, which I chose actually carefully to make a point about the view, it's not just that in architecture we need to prioritize views in order to commune with nature, but the fact that there's this solitary palm tree that gives you this focus that you look at shows you that there's a boundary in space. And that's actually what you're reading when you look out that way, when you orient yourself. And orienting yourself first to yourself and then to a landscape is extremely important to our understanding of boundaries of space and how we feel. So even if you're gazing at just the blue of this pool, the textures of the light that you're seeing in it, the color play, these are the things that your body and your brain are recording so that you take this experience with you to understand the other experiences that maybe await you in the house that you just came from. In this example, I just wanted to show you a different climate where we're also prioritizing seeing nature and viewing it. This is in addition to a house in upstate New York where we basically the whole design is focused towards a single view of the exterior. And you get to be able to enjoy it both by seeing and by being in it. So how do we bring it indoors? What do we do to make that same feeling of richness come alive? In my world and in the way that I do it, I like to layer the texture on texture in order to create somewhat the complexity of nature as closely as we can. So in this instance, you're looking at a very favorite old friend of mine, a cactus that was 80 years old. I was privileged to have him in one of my projects, and very sad to see him go, actually. And in this image, you'll see, again, the layering of stripped and torn leaves against a textured paper backdrop, which plays one on top of the other to give you a sense of scale and to give you a sense of the difference in the ribs of the leaves versus the ribs of the wall. And the reason I think this is important is that we all tend to, you know, put a plant in a corner and call it a day. There's a little bit more to it than that. And then this example just touches on something that I do think is a sense, and this is a sense of proportion and a sense of detail. This comes from an exhibit in the cloisters, and it shows our sense of human beings being alone but communing in a huge space. And the way we do this is by relating to the detail in that space, by getting closer to things that are of a scale that we can understand. And lastly, I'd like to show you the project that Kelly had mentioned. This is an example actually of a readout of how people felt when they walked through 3 different spaces that we designed along with Google, with the International Arts and Minds Lab at Johns Hopkins, and with Muto, the furniture company, to see how people felt in space. And Michael will, I think, start playing the video. There we go. Michael, there's sound to it. I guess it's speeding along, but I'll do the voiceover. So this is
making the decisions we do.
There we go.
Those things that we as designers intuit, neuroscience is now proving have an effect.
Oh, we're starting over. Okay.
The way this project is unusual is that we are actually pursuing a principle. I really believe that form follows feeling, and feeling is really what space and architecture are about. Space actually affects people. Design matters. It's why we spend the time making the decisions we do. Those things that we as designers intuit, neuroscience is now proving have an effect. Google created an exhibition that is showing design's impact on our biology.
The way that I explain neuroaesthetics is really simple.
It's basically how your brain changes on the arts. When you have a heightened aesthetic experience, like a piece of music, a sunrise, things that really elevate your everyday experiences, they change you. They change your biology, they change your mood, they change your emotion. I called Suchi Reddy and I said, taking the neuroaesthetic principles, could you create 3 different rooms that would evoke different responses? The goal is to see how people resonate with space and to really find out whether what they think they resonate with is what their body is actually resonating.
We respond to the aesthetics of our environments, whether we realize it or not. The band can demonstrate with data from the sensors that actually is happening. Heart activity, respiratory activity, skin temperature, skin conductance. We figure out from the data which room is the one that feels the calmest or the most at ease for people.
Where does your physiology feel most peaceful? I think it's what people are searching for. The space between the notes, the place where they can come and just be.
The interiors where we work and where we live have a deep impact on our well-being. We always known it and believed in it, but we haven't been able to quantify it and prove it. You enter a space and it's like, I like it, but why?
This is about data used as a mirror back to yourself. Data is just a bunch of numbers, and we wanted to make it artistic in its expression.
It can be really hard to put an aesthetic experience into words. But suddenly by combining science and technology, we get a new language.
Selected room 2 as the room that you're the most common.
Maybe a watercolor can tell more than 1,000 words.
Technology has the ability to help you know yourself better. The problems of the future are only going to become more complicated. Solutions have to happen in this collaboration of technology, the arts, and science.
Thank you, Suchi.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So I think at this point we can have all the panelists turn on their video and have a Q&A session. I know I've had a couple questions that we can now start answering. So if anybody has questions for Jemila or for Suchi, please feel free to type them in the Q&A section. I'm going to ask one that was previously asked, which was for Jemila. How was the dig site location chosen?
So the dig site is at a residency called This Will Take Time, which is a great name for a project like this. It was a brand new residency, and I wanted the work to be in a site that would be cared for, that was an institutional site, but was not ultimately going to be turned into a sculpture park. So I basically, to find that location, I just told every person that I knew that I wanted to do this project. And in the wonderfully generous way that the New York community exists, people don't go, that's a terrible idea, you're going to kill yourself. They come up with suggestions, and 2 people actually suggested this place, and it was perfect in the end. Are there more questions?
There, sorry, I just realized I was muted. This one's for Suchi. What was your main finding or discovery from the Google installation?
So one thing I did want to say about the installation, which isn't really clear from the film, is that we had to have groups of 10 people be in rooms for 10 minutes by themselves with no phones and not speaking to anyone else. So this condition also of being alone that was such a shock to people, to just be in a space and be able to commune with it. And the thing that we found, because obviously we didn't keep anyone's data, it was all deleted. And really once an image was created that showed them what their reaction was physically as a graphic, we didn't keep any of the information. So it was hard to actually look at the whole thing. But I, sort of sat outside and asked people as they left what their impressions were. And I think the biggest finding is that people are actually surprised to know that their environment affects them. And oftentimes what they find that their body is maybe most at ease in is not the thing that they expected it to be. Because they would come out saying, oh, but that's not my taste. And so there was this real question of what taste is and of what you actually are reacting to in that minute. And then the other kinds of deeper questions that came out of it were really things like socioeconomic questions. I had somebody come out saying, that the spaces made them think because they weren't from, this culture, but from another country, that they were wondering about whether they belonged, whether they deserved it. And it's really interesting to think about it because space has this incredible action where it can start all of these kinds of thoughts. It can teach you to think about your environment, your political situation, your socioeconomic situation. And I think as designers often, or as architects, we forget that. We're designing for a problem. We're not being thoughtful enough and really thinking about the far-reaching impacts of what we do are.
Thank you. We have a couple more in the Q&A, which I'm gonna do one of these first. Jemila, did you notice your body shape and strength changing over the course of this project? And if so, how did those changes echo in your life after the project?
So I sort of described this braiding together of the body and the mind and the spirit, and there were times when it was clear to me that my body couldn't keep getting stronger and couldn't keep getting pushed unless I emotionally and psychologically caught up to the pressure that I was putting my body under, and vice versa. So I couldn't really grow in those other ways until my body could catch up with the strength. So on day 10, my body really started to break down, and that was the day that I had to somewhat take a break. I think I dug for about two or 3 hours, which for me on that project is a break, so that I could recover. But the way that it has affected my body since then is that you test your, like once you test your body in that way and put it under that kind of stress, you actually always have to keep maintaining it, because as it atrophies, it really hurts. And I kind of think about those other elements as being the same. So if I'm not spiritually nourishing myself or creatively nourishing myself, and I'm not emotionally attending to myself, I'll feel the same kind of atrophy pains. That's a kind of an answer to that question.
Thank you. I guess maybe I'll ask one more for you, Jemila. How did your process involve writing? You're writing a book about the work now, but what process did writing play in the day-to-day making of the work? Did you develop a process in advance, or did it emerge as you created the work?
It became really impossible to do anything beyond just responding to the most urgent emails. And also I would write very tiny captions on the Instagram. So there's an Instagram for this whole project, which you can actually go to, and you can see I posted from it every day, and very short reflections. So they were extremely brief and spare, a little bit closer to, say, the poems that I read. But it's taken me 2 years to be able to get to writing the words down. However, language has always been a part of that work, and I haven't typically been a writer until now. My relationship to language has always been verbal. So I'm a much more comfortable verbal storyteller and communicator than I am as a writer. And that's actually brand new for me.
And there are a couple questions specifically related to this pandemic. One, well, I guess you can each kind of respond to this. One person said, Suchi, has the current pandemic shifted the way you think about designing for isolation and connection? And Jemila, what kinds of effects is the current quarantine having on the writing of the book?
Yes, definitely. I really do think that this is an amazing opportunity for us all to really think about our humanness, you know, and how we connect to things, and being able to take time to understand what restoration really means, and kind of the restorative quality of space. And I know that that's really difficult for, you know, lots of different types of reasons. Like, there are people who are quarantined with other people and they're around them all the time and they don't want to be, you know, and their sense of aloneness is troubled by this, you know, or their sense of humanness really wants a place to go where they can, you know, meet lots of people. So this kind of thing where, you know, we're always designing for community, you know, but the community that I think is the most important really is our community with ourselves. And until that's really established and it's clear, and we know what our reactions are to things, and we have a very careful and thoughtful understanding of that, we can't really communicate with other people in that same way. So in terms of designing for isolation, I think if I were to create a design for someone to be in isolation, it would be to create a supportive space, you know, and to really understand what that support is. And neuroaesthetically, there are several elements that you can use to design a supportive space, but you're really always looking at something that feels like it offers space for comfort and space for thinking.
I have some questions here on the Q&A that aren't on the chat.
I think Jemila still had to answer that her question. Yeah.
Yeah, so to answer that question about how the quarantine is affecting the writing, my creative process really often happens, it is often a necessity that I am somewhat isolated to do the work that I do. It enables the focus. However, the quarantine itself, I found that I've had to really distance myself from the hysteria of it, which is extremely distracting. But it's had these other added effects of my neighborhood is now extremely quiet, which is so wonderful for writing, because normally I can hear the music from the shop down below us and a lot of sirens and a lot of traffic. And one of the things that I find really oppressive about trying to do this creative work in the city, and one of the reasons I often go and do residencies, is because I need that silence. So it's been a little bit of a gift for me. I've also created my home environment much to Suchi's design philosophy. It is an environment of textures, of plants, of things that support me, because they, as objects or as living things, to their core, they feel supportive creatively to me. And I even have a humongous stone that's, it weighs as much as I do. I have this huge stone that I dragged out of the woods that I keep in my house. And it is the most grounding thing to stand on this stone. But I do actually really feel for other creatives in this moment, because I think there's a real pressure on a lot of people to somehow magically produce something as though this is a residency. It's not a residency. It's very stressful. So to put that extra creative pressure on yourself is really rough. And I've been doing that to myself. And actually next week I'm taking a break from writing to do a little bit more creative play, because that is so necessary. And especially if you're doing creative work that like this requires really just such heavy digging, you know, literally metaphorically heavy digging. So I would say in many ways it has actually been a bit of a gift to me, but that is not to belittle how difficult this is.
Yeah, so we have a lot of really good questions. I think this one from Riyadh. Thank you both for your lectures. Two different yet similar perspectives. Suchi, what do you think about Jemila's perspective, where she saw importance of the emotional and physical process of digging physically, and how could we as architects learn from her experiment?
You know, it's absolutely so beautiful to see your work, Jemila, and it is an architectural act. You know, what you're doing is an architectural act. Making a space is a very physical, you know, that act of doing it is so important. And the thing that for me is important, whether it's art or architecture, is really this idea of also being able to move through space in time. So there's always this element of time, which, you know, up until now, we've been really kind of shackled by the idea of like photographs being the only way to really represent something, or video, but video doesn't even have, you know, the sense of actually being there in that space and sensing the proportions of the space around you in the same way that your body is sensing it. You know, because your brain can see something on a screen and think it's something, but your body actually needs to feel that. So I think the similarity between what Jemila does to the way that I think about architecture is very, very close. And to really make that beautiful form and shape that cascades out from, you know, and there's a symmetry to it. I mean, I'm sure there's aside from it being a meteorite, you know, there's things about circles, there's essential forms, there are all of these things that, you know, we respond to as humans on a very essential level. And I think what she's done is a really great piece of architecture, could be seen as a really great piece of architecture, where you're paring it down to its essentials, and you're really creating a space where a human can feel or resonate with an idea. And that's really what we do, you know, as architects. So I think that's the way they come together.
And Suchi, there are a couple related questions. One, Teresa said, I assume you apply the principle of form follows feeling to all of your projects. Do you discuss this with your clients? And if so, are they open and excited about this way of thinking? And there was another similar one that said, is it hard to convince clients of working with this philosophy of neuroaesthetics?
Actually, no. I have not found that to be difficult at all. I think when you tell people kind of thoughtfully that you really want to make a space that supports them, that has to do with them, which honestly I think it's one of my, I really think that if everyone in the world could have a space that was made for them, that suited them, we'd have a much different world. We don't, because so much of it is meant to be adapting to an environment that isn't really adapted for us. And so whenever you offer somebody that opportunity to really adapt something thoughtfully to them, to their needs, you know, to their wants, to their feelings, and to the things that you can perhaps divine, that they may not see that they need yet, I haven't ever found any real resistance to it at all. You know, if there's a budget problem, yes, you know, there can be a discussion about it, but generally that's not even something that's necessary to go into.
Thank you.
I think I know the answer to this, but Jemila, is this a project you'd be willing to do at another location? Also, how do you see this as an ongoing project? The physicality of new journeys through digging.
So Human Meteorite was very much a work made at a certain time because it was necessary. Definitely one of the most life-changing experiences of my life. I'm not really sure what I would get from repeating it again. However, it did change my practice in that I now make earthworks. I didn't even realize I was making an earthwork, to be honest. And it's beautiful to hear Suchi describe it as architecture, because I believe the same. And actually, when I finished that work, I remember standing there and realizing that I had done something that humans have done for thousands of years. They have made these shapes in the land, and it has rooted them into connecting to place. So it really did feel like that. But my interests now in my very recent earthworks have been in working in acoustic earthworks, which are still digging into the ground. So at Cooler Ranch, which is another initiative by Cooler Gallery that Michael hosted last summer, I did the first of these acoustic experiments, which was called Listening Well. And while it is another crater form, essentially, it serves a different purpose, and it is a carved parabolic ear into the ground designed to alter the acoustic resonance of the environment. And in a way, and actually this also ties to what Suchi is talking about, I really felt urgently that after doing Human Meteorite, which was so much about the physical experience of that space and not really being able to transmit that through a screen, it made me realize that I needed to make works that showed people that they can't just be reduced to an image, that you have to go to these places to experience the senses that they give you in much greater detail.
That's my total beef about architecture, that people have to go there and see it.
They do, because they also have to know what place it's in, right? So you have to know how, and I also love that you showed these buildings in different times of day, because I've also been thinking about the difference between being alone in a sterile environment that does not change. Mm-hmm. So like a waiting room that has no windows, how anxious you feel. If you don't have transformation happening around you to allow your internal emotional landscape to transform with it, mm-hmm. then you feel extremely anxious and stuck. And I don't think that is acknowledged so much, but I think it is in the field of neuroaesthetics that you're looking into. This is why we need plants, because plants remind us that it is spring. We need days that change from rain to sun, and these are also our teachers. But also, since when is it okay for you to be sealed off and not connected to your world? And I mean, it's quite obvious to me why we have a loneliness issue if people aren't actually taught how to be with themselves and how to make kin with their environment. Of course they're going to feel alone.
Exactly.
Couple questions, one from Matt. I totally agree that the spaces we live can affect our feelings. Did you notice a consistency in the readings of each participant's feelings per their aesthetic tastes? And this is for you, Suchi. And then another question from Gail was, what type of technology did you actually use to get and transfer this data?
So no, people had lots of different kinds of experiences and things that they didn't experience. But I will say one of the things that was the loveliest was a couple of friends of mine who were married came out of one of the rooms, and they were both comparing their mandalas, and they both flared at the same time. And they said, oh, that was when you and I looked at that book together and we enjoyed it. And, you know, I had curated all these books in there as well, and the things to do for 10 minutes while, you know, you couldn't talk to anybody and you had to be with yourself. And in this one room, there were all these pop-up books, and that was brightly colored, and people were looking at these books and they were relating to them. And so this is the kind of thing that I think, you know, it's not just space, it's connection to other people. You know, it's like being together that really sparks and changes things. And the trouble with trying to come to a new formula for design, which I resist, is because as humans, we're maybe an incredibly plastic animal, and our brains are incredibly plastic, and they're changing every minute. The stimulus is changing every minute, and, you know, to some degree, science can't ever catch up with it, because they're always doing it. They have to do it in a sterile environment where they have the same stimulus 250 times and get the same result in order to know that this is going to work and that they can say this is real, but in real time and space, we're doing this all the time in our environments. We're moving around and we're feeling these things. So no, there was no real consistency really. The one thing I will say is that the first room I had designed almost like a cave. I was inspired by cave paintings and the first caves that we created. And so the textures were very earthy and it was round and we had that 80-year-old cactus in there and, a tapestry that was made with by Claudia Youngstra of this beautiful wool that was dyed with the dyes of flowers, and you could really feel it. And this was the first space that people came into just in sequence, and almost everyone loved it. But then they would find that their body was maybe reacting to one of the other spaces in a different way, and it would surprise them. So I did see that. And to the technology question, yes, to transfer it, it was understanding the data was a proprietary system that Google had developed in order to do that. So it's not really something that's available to other designers. And it was also something that we experimented with. So there are other systems of doing it though. And when you do look at neuroscientific studies and studies in neuroaesthetics, there are lots of different ways to do this. You can study affect of people, you can study the tone of voice of people when they're enjoying a space or not, to know how they're reacting to each other and how they're reacting to the space. So there are other tools out there.
To the question of privilege of choice, that was running through me as I sit here quite alone and affected by loneliness and mental illness before the isolation was forced upon me. Are there suggestions from Jemila and Suchi on how to cope in an emergent situation rather than planned and designed through space and time?
I'm happy to speak to that. Because I make work that is staying present with what I feel are the emotional struggles of the moment, I have experienced also what you're talking about. I am someone that also does, like I think many people, struggle from various points of mental illness, where I'm really mentally not well. And the project that Michael spoke about that I showed at Cooler Gallery, The Wake, was a film that I made about environmental grief. That was a planned project, but I had no idea actually the weight of that project would crush me with. And I ended up really quite depressed for 8 months after that. And so I have been thinking about how do people move through this time of social isolation, especially those that are mentally struggling. And I think it can be really frustrating when you're in that state to have people tell you things like, oh, well, if you exercise every day, if you meditate every day, these are the things that will get you through. Because either sometimes those things are too hard to do, or actually sometimes you're already doing them and you're still depressed. I think there is a tremendous healing benefit in being in contact with other people. And to think about this time as not being able to have that, to not have that electricity that will heal you, it is bewildering, honestly. I think the best thing that you can do is find ways to be with yourself in this without pressure on yourself. And one of those ways, I think, is, I'm not sure what kind of environment you're in, but like Suchi said about having these environments that are sensually strong, if you can find ways to stay just with your senses in your day, that actually will heal you. If you can sit and if you have a plant or something and just spend some time tending to that plant and use that plant to learn something of yourself. I think that these are the things that can heal you. But these are such huge questions. We really don't know. We really don't know.
I agree with Jemila, and it's a really good question, and I totally feel for you. Loneliness is a huge problem. Mental illness is a huge problem, and really we can't solve these problems alone. You know, we have to solve them with other people, and we have to solve them together. But it has been proven, if it's of any use to you, that engaging in some kind of artistic endeavor, even if it is like making a puzzle or making any kind of a drawing or listening to music, and it doesn't matter, you know, nobody needs to like what you do. No one needs to think it's great. You don't even need to like what you do or think it's great. But if you engage in that mechanism, just the fact that you're motoring out these emotions, these feelings, you're giving them a place to go, will help. It has been known to help and to really stimulate essentially the reward circuitry in your brain, which will be super helpful to you. So that's one thing that you could try if you haven't tried it. And maybe, you know, this question of pressure and pressure to perform and pressure to perform, whether it's to yourself or to other people, is something that we're also laden with and burdened with. And I think that this is actually a really great time to let go of it. And thirdly, the senses. You know, if there is a way in which you can really find your own sensibility, you know, how you actually feel when nothing is acting on you. What does that feel like? You know, use it as a baseline. Think about how you feel then when you touch something. Think about those kinds of haptic connections to things can be really helpful in this kind of condition. I wish that I had more useful or more knowledgeable, in-depth information for you, but I think those things will be a decent start.
I absolutely agree with everything that you just said as well. And I was like, oh yes, this. And there was a point actually when I was in Iceland and suffering from exhaustion and depression that someone showed me something that had helped them, which was to do self-portraits every day. Now, self-portraits are not something I would typically ever feel comfortable doing. And yet when I was really struggling, they gave me a tether, and it became a thing that I did just standing in front of the mirror. So it was never like a thing that I was too precious. I would just stand in front of the mirror, and it gave me a moment to attend to myself. And then really after 8 days of these self-portraits, because that I only did it for 8 days, some people do it for much longer, but at the end of those 8 days, I was sticking them up. I went away and I came back, and I was able to see myself. I was able to see how depressed I had been. And I was able to see that I had grown through it into a different state. So being able to find some way to witness also how you have transformed is super helpful. And another thing, I just remembered a tip that a friend gave me, especially I think now when all the days are just going one into the next. I think it's easy to feel like whatever state you're in today is the one you've been in for months. If you can just on a paper calendar write down like 3 words, how do I feel today? This has helped me in the past before as well.
And then I'll just suggest the thing that I suggest for everything, poetry. It just seems to help.
Good suggestion. I'm going to move on to a couple more questions since I know we don't have a ton of time left. This one is from Michael Chen. As a small counterpoint to Suchi's observation about Jemila's project, it seems to me that the purpose of the project, not in a sculpture park, is in many ways about personal process, experience, introspection, as compared to architecture, which is more about others. I'd be interested in hearing about the panelists' thoughts about work for the self versus for others around this theme of being alone.
I think whether you make it for yourself or other people, it's still architecture. You know, and I don't necessarily think architecture is solely the domain of more than one person. But I'll disagree with Michael there and say that whether it's in a sculpture park or whether it's in nature, it's still architecture. Like mountains to me can be pieces of architecture, can act as pieces of architecture. If you're crossing them, if they make a boundary, if they're letting you know that there's a field that you have to go through, you know, there's these things that are very important in landscape. You could make architecture with no architecture, and make an architectural feeling, an architectural experience. There's a piece of land that I'm looking at working in, which is ringed by, I think Jemila would love this place, and maybe we should talk about this. There's a ring of big stones that actually form the boundary of this space. And it's a conundrum as to what to put in there, because you kind of don't want to do anything. You want it to just be a space that the stones hold, that you want to be in. But, you know, we're forced with thinking about shelter, and then therefore we have to think about how to do that carefully. So it'll be a really interesting problem to solve.
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak to this too for a second too. Yeah, for people that don't know, also Kelly and I are designers too, so we do a lot of like spatial design work. And actually in kind of digging into like what readings that we would pair for this, because we taken through a lot of written work to kind of come up with a compendium that can go along with each topic. The kind of physical manifestation of architecture that I think best showcases being alone is somehow grand, massive architecture that is just empty. Like churches, like domes with oculus, planetariums. Yeah, but to that point, like the mountains, they're all like in reference to large natural spaces and experiences that are universal and singular only in that they force you to have a singular experience. They force you to like look up and feel humble in the presence of something that's so much bigger than you and something that is like out of your control. And actually a lot of the planetarium specifically is one of the readings that we brought in, is Robert Smithson's piece about touring through the Hayden Planetarium while alone, and about how at first it is about being present with himself and understanding the detail, understanding the text on the walls and each small moment, and then realizing the grandeur that is presented back to him. And he just allows his mind to expand and make bigger connections and channel the history of the world through this writing. And I think that is a unifying thread between Jemila and Suchi's work that I see. And yeah, channeling in on the smallest little moment allows you to make these huge connections and expand out. And that's like something that's been singularly present in all of these pieces that we found about being alone, because being alone allows room. There's space in being alone.
Jemila, did you want to add anything, or should we?
It's interesting to think about the human in the architecture. Something I've been thinking about recently is how when you have a person inside architecture, they become kind of one. So it's this notion of the holobiont, which is kind of, I guess, like a new word that's going around, which is, you know, our bodies are also homes to many microbes and tiny minuscule insects and things. So we aren't just humans, we are a collection. And so I've been thinking about apartment buildings, whether you can really think about architecture as part of nature, because it is, you see so many creatures that build architecture. And I made a work a number of years ago in Mexico called Casa, which was a work that I made myself a tiny architecture in the way that an insect would, because I was in this town for a very short period of time. So I needed architecture that worked in the way that insect architecture worked, which is like, it's just there for me while I do this transformation. And I sat on the side of the road in this paper mache cocoon with my face exposed. And I had befriended the children in the neighborhood because they would come and tease us. And I asked if they would paint the outside of it in the way that their homes were painted on the outside. And it became this really amazing experience of reciprocity. And I think since then, it did change my feeling about architecture. Mexico really changed my feeling about architecture, because I also started thinking, I was there during Dia de los Muertos, and I was thinking about homes for dead people also. And then how, if we come to architecture as a sacred space, it is actually us and us within the architecture, the body and the architecture together as one, that makes it sacred. So I guess I'm in this question of, if the body is a temple, does that make the temple a body?
Yes, I would agree. I think the answer to that is yes.
All right, I'm going to move on to a different question. I found it really interesting, Suchi, the notion of textures and materials creating layers and informing depth of field. Could you speak some more about the origins of this, or if it's more current, any particularly successful examples that you admire?
Wow. There are so many successful examples that I admire. There are just too many to list, honestly. I think this idea of texture, really comes from, there are lots of studies about it. You could look it up. There will be some, I'm sure, in the references and the readings that I found, and I'm sure in what Michael and Kelly found as well. But the idea of layering, I think, is the important thing, of the complexity of texture, because people tend to do this thing where they're like, okay, I have to enliven this wall, and I'm going to stick something on it in one place. It's not about that, really. It's a much more complex layering of textures that actually causes depth and understanding of depth to happen. And also the relationship of scale in texture, which I didn't go into in a lot of detail, but it's also why I related it back to biophilia and being in nature, because when you look at, when you're outside and you just look at the different scales, like you can look in a green landscape at the different scales of the blades of grass, to the different sizes of leaves, to the different sizes of the leaves in the ground, to the leaves in the trees, and it's all the same material, it's all the same color, or at least the same color family, and yet there's an incredible range of scale and of arrangement. And so really these ideas of how texture affects us comes from our relationship to nature. Like you could look at nature in any minute and be able to read that. I always say that one of the best things about being trained as an architect is that I never get bored. I could be, staring at a blade of grass for a long time and, really learning a lot about it. And I think it's that kind of complexity that's really an important part of texture, aside from the fact of just feeling the difference. These ideas of relief, like what Michael was talking about, being in big spaces. That one slide that I was showing of like a figure in a church where there is a lot of detail. So, you have to break texture down to different levels so that your brain actually understands it differently. And there's a whole, like there's a reason why we respond to symmetry. There are fractal patterns in nature. There's triangles that respond to each other. These things we're wired to understand. And those kinds of things make us, immediately set up a kind of order that we recognize. And so if you're being a really good architect or a really good designer, you understand where to play that and where to break it so that you can form new things, right? And the skill of doing that well is really what distinguishes a good work from a mediocre one from a bad one. And it is a complex skill. That's all I have to say about it. But there are incredible examples of texture. Like I would even say, like Luis Barragan's architecture, for one, is incredible example. And speaking of Mexico, you know, of the layering of shapes and forms. And even if everything is stucco, there's different levels of texture in stucco. There's the way that the water and the rocks and the stones that he places so carefully play against those things. So it can be a very spare composition. It doesn't have to be dense, because people generally think of texture and they think of something dense. It can be a very large texture. It can be a very hugely scaled texture that you work with. But it's really understanding how those things can work with each other.
Thank you. I have read a couple articles about rethinking open floor plan design in homes and offices as a lesson for the future of design based on this current moment. Suchi, what are your thoughts on this?
It's a very interesting thing. You know, my studio has an open plan, and has always had an open plan. And what I find about open plans is that they can generate this atmosphere of learning, that you learn a lot even if you're not involved in it. And part of that is the same kind of learning that you do in a city, where you're not able to separate the noise, but you learn from the noise. You know, you learn what's happening, you hear something that's happening to somebody else, and you develop faster. From a neuroscience perspective also, there's a lot more stimulus. And whenever we're in an environment that has a lot more stimulus, we make more brain cells. And that is something that will be very interesting to study once, you know, we're through this segment of being alone, because this idea of touch and not being able to touch other people, which is also very important for us. And a lot of us are without that at this moment. It'll be very interesting to see what happens. But I think there is certainly this need for closed space, and you'll see that designs are going towards open plans, but also creating spaces for people to retreat to. And especially in this time when we're all on these devices, like this kind of being alone is also, to an extent, a kind of a degradation of the experience of being alone, if you know what I mean. It's not a whole experience of being alone. You think you're having a private conversation with someone, but the fact that you have to do it through a medium that is different than air makes a distance there that degrades the quality of that conversation. And we're doing the best we can in that situation, but to get back to that kind of one-on-one, and even if it is, you know, to go back to the person who was asking about loneliness, perhaps it just occurred to me, perhaps you speak to yourself, you know, and you learn how to bounce those airwaves properly. So yeah, I don't know. I think you could see it one way or the other. I'm not sold on open plans or on closed plans. I think that there is a balance between those two.
Thank you, Suchi and Jemila, for your insightful and beautiful work. My question is for both of you. Do you think that there will be a broader appreciation for our environment, both natural and architectural, after this coronavirus epidemic? How about towards others?
I have to hope so. If this doesn't teach us that, I don't know what will. It's incontrovertible evidence to see blue skies over China and dolphins in Venice and no smog over LA, and, you know, to be so clearly shown that our actions have an effect, and to not be able to understand that, you know, or to come back to understanding that our connection with people is a precious thing, that our time on this planet is fragile, that our time in these bodies is short, and the things that we do with them. You know, I think this is a big reset for a lot of things. For the planet, it's a reset for us. It's a reset in very difficult and terrible ways for the economy. Yeah, I think we will definitely come out of it changed.
I have hope. I'm a person that generally tries to live without any expectations. And I think one of the things that's quite incredible about this moment is just how we are having to contend with existing in a state of deep uncertainty. Anything that we thought the future would look like has been affected by this. And the beautiful thing is that we're all in synchronicity, in that no one actually knows. But I agree that I really hope that to see how nature is in spaces that we fill with noise and machinery, to see how nature is when we are not interfering with it so much. I really hope people are moved by that. So I have hope. I have no expectations, and my answer would just be maybe.
All right. I know we're approaching 8 o'clock, but I think that this is a good topic, since a lot of us are probably sitting in our homes right now. Maybe both of you have a comment on this. Do you have suggestions of any small changes or additions we can make to our current spaces to help us feel more connected and calm?
I would say either find or make an object that you would like to keep with you, that you would like to touch. It doesn't have to be very big, you know, it could be anything, you know, something that you make it in your environment.
Jemila, do you have any thoughts on
That's a
that?
beautiful suggestion. I guess, what do? I go, when I turn up to residencies, I often rearrange the space so it suits me right. I think spend some time imagining how you could reform your space. I think it's easy to just assume often when we move into a place that the bed is meant to go there. And it surprises me sometimes when I go into a room and I don't think it makes sense how they've put things together, because it might interfere with my sleep or something. And so I think one thing that you can do is to also give yourself permission to just rearrange your space. And that sounds very like, I don't know, Marie Kondo or something, but it can be a playful thing. So to realize that you're not in a static environment, just even if you do it in a way that makes it terribly inconvenient. You know, when you paint the walls of your space, you have to pull everything out and into the middle of the room. And there's a moment where you experience that extreme chaos of that and inconvenience of that. And then when you put everything back, you actually find you make different decisions. So you do get rid of some things. You do decide, oh, actually, this thing that I never look at is so much more beautiful here. So I think I'm thinking about how can you attend to what is already there, and how can you really, you know, love your space. You know, give your space some love, because it is your extra shell. It is the body that you are in. So I think it's good to care for it in that way.
I think that's such a great point. I think sometimes we forget that our space is changeable and we take it for granted, and remember, we forget to remind ourselves that we have freedom and power over spaces that have been the way they are for a long time. And spending time in our homes, I think it's important to realize that we can go deeper, we can notice more, we can create new things from things that we have in a closet that we forgot were there. So I think there's a lot of possibility in spaces that we take for granted often and think are familiar. So just a little thought there. But
no, I think giving permission to yourself to feel it and take the agency to make that change is really important. A thing that I talk a lot with Kelly about is I'm a cat person, but I'm actually really surprised they haven't made a cameo, but they're like bouncing around. I actually find cats to be very attuned to space in a way that other animals I haven't experienced with, where they are very, very good at finding the most comfortable spot for themselves at any moment. They maybe don't so much have the ability to like change the space itself, but they're really impacted by like how messy the space is. If new things come into the space, they're very, very curious to like get inside a box or explore these things, get inside a hole, hang under a table. But especially in like a lot of the topics that we've been talking about today, they're so good at like finding the only sunny spot in the house and laying in it because that brings them pleasure, and to find the perfect like balled up t-shirt to like roll up on. And I think that actually spending a lot more time through the day cycle of a cat, 2 cats, these past few weeks has been really interesting to be like, oh yeah, they know what's up. Like, should do a little bit more of that. Like,
well, I don't think there are any more questions. I don't know if anybody has any last remarks or comments, but if not,
You guys.
oh yeah.
Nice to be here. And thank you, Jemila. That was really inspiring.
Thank you, Suchi. I would love to talk to you about that giant ring of
Let's
rocks. What a dream.
Yeah. It's a bit of fun. Yeah.
Thank you two so much for joining us. It was incredible. I think everybody appreciated the conversation. And for those of you who maybe weren't there at the beginning, both Suchi and Jemila have essays that they've written that we will be sharing with you guys on our website, and we will also send you a follow-up email along with readings. Oh, yep. So here's on the website where you'll be able to find the essays, additional readings that you can occupy yourself with over the coming weeks, and some other good stuff. So feel free to go here and reference those in the future, and then we'll also send them to you as a follow-up if you'd like to do some reading after.
Yeah, and we're going to continue to add some things into here. This is just how much we could get up in time for the event, but we have the essay versions of the presentations from Jemila and Suchi, as well as a bunch of references that from all of us. Each one of these is like something that you can click through and download and read. It's a longer written piece. And then we're going to add an extended reading list as well. And then we also, for people that weren't at the first event, we made the same version of that for the last event too. So you can dig back and get into, like, this is much more of like the thesis for the whole series on a human approach to interior space. And it really builds on, it's really like the grounding for everything that we were talking about today. But all of that is available up now on the website. So it's wearepeopleandplaces.com.
And we can close with 2 lovely comments. One from Melissa. Thank you so much to Gems. Beautiful to hear them. And thank you for hosting Be Well and extending my thoughts to everyone. A nice way to end the day with some food for thought. So on that note, thank you so much, everybody, for joining.
Thank you all so much. This has been a real pleasure.
Yeah. Take care of yourselves, and we will see you soon, hopefully.
Thank you.
See you soon.